Today, I am super pleased to welcome David Manheim with us. So just to backtrack a little bit, this group is the Existential Hope group. It's a group in which at this high stakes time in human civilization, it's the place where we cooperate to build beautiful futures by catalyzing knowledge around potential paths to get there, and kind of scheme on how to plug in and do that. So David Manheim is Foresight Fellow in Positive Long-Term Futures. And today we'll discuss an upcoming book chapter on Eucatastrophes and dynamic stability, exploring tensions between risk and opportunities for societies. David is also a visiting professor at the Technion, focusing on long-term risks and future prospects for humanity. His recent work has focused on understanding and mitigating global catastrophic risk, and most recently, responding to and learning from COVID-19. So David, thank you so much for joining us today. And I guess today we'll discuss the concept of Eucatastrophes, and you will tell us what it is, and then maybe try to understand it better to see if we should maybe try to encourage these Eucatastrophes and how. And now you have the floor.
Thank you, Lou. So I'm going to be talking about Eucatastrophes and a little bit about the general notion of cooperation. And this is for book chapter is, I think, a little bit aspirational since I'm still attempting to get the book proposal together to do that. But what will hopefully be at some point a book chapter. So to start out, we should define our terms. I think that Cotton-Barratt and Ord's definition is a really useful one, in that what we're thinking about when we talk about existential hope is that things can be much better than they are now. Not just that we avoid existential risk, but that things become much, much better. And I think that there's a idea that maybe that's not realistic. Maybe that's not something that that happens. And I want to go back to the quote that they used to introduce the term Eucatastrophe, and quote Tolkien as saying, "This is indeed how things really do work in the great world for which our nature is made." And I want to talk a little bit about that as I go through this. So the idea is that we're trying to prepare for and allow for wonderful surprises. And the question is, what lets that happen? And I don't know if Mark is on this call, but I stole the graphic from him because it's a good one for kind of thinking about what it is that we're trying to do when we get to Eucatastrophe. And that is, and the collective action dilemma thing moved over while I was editing the slide at some point. But we have a trap that we're typically in where we can't move forward. And his concept was that we use credible commitments in the form of blockchain and smart contracts to be able to bridge the gap to move past the collection action dilemma to Pareto tropism. I think there's a more general way that happens, which is that kind of whatever state things are in, we're typically stuck there to some extent. And what happens when things change is there has to be something that breaks in some way, something that changes abruptly. But an abrupt change usually gives us the opportunity to push towards Eucatastrophe, push towards something better. It's very rare that you have a stable and functioning system and you change something randomly and it's suddenly much better. That would be very shocking. Most random changes to systems are negative, as we find in evolution and other places. But if we have an idea for what it is that can change and enough slack in the system so that we can do something other than just just fix the thing that broke. So if all we have the imagination for or willingness to do is fix the thing that broke and go back to exactly where we were, we don't go over any bridge. We don't get past anything. We just fix ourselves. So we also need somebody has to have leverage and willingness to change. And then the last thing, which I think is generally important, though not always, though I do want to talk about it, is cooperation. And the reason why I want to talk about that in particular is because it's the focus of the book that I'm trying to write. So what happens? So I think some of the time something good just does happen, something gets better in some way. But more often there's something that changes that's negative, that breaks something, and then you get a positive kind of event. So this is supposed to be a graph over time, a poorly drawn graph over time of let's say overall utility for humanity in general, and not intended to represent any particular events or any particular time scale. And the question is, what do the dynamics actually look like? What does this look like when it happens? So we have a couple of examples from early on, very, very early on. But if we're talking about long term, I figure going back a couple billion years is fine. The great oxidation event is where organisms first started to be able to do photosynthesis. They started changing carbon dioxide into oxygen, and suddenly there was lots of oxygen in the atmosphere, which was not so great for everything around because all of it was anaerobic. It died off when there was lots of oxygen around. So you had this event that caused basically everything alive to die off. And the few things that survived managed to be really, really important in that they ended up being the forerunners of almost all life, well, a large portion of life and almost all of the life that we care about in the world now. So there was a eucatastrophe that was enabled by the fact that there was oxygen in the atmosphere, that suddenly we had this more reactive item in the atmosphere that was able to be worked with. But the same kind of thing happened earlier when we got this eucatastrophe, which was suddenly organisms became able to create energy, like to build energy and do something with it. And that's what led to the oxidation event. So you get both of these dynamics where something good can lead to something bad, or something bad can lead to something good. It's large changes tend to destabilize, and the direction of the impact can differ. There are some places where this was, actually accomplished by people. So I think that that's important for thinking about what it is we care about. The Enlightenment is an interesting example because when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the wall of the church, it destabilized things a lot. He was, a very influential, a raging anti-Semite, I will note, but also a very influential figure in destabilizing what had been, thousands of years of stability in Europe. It also helped pave the way for the Renaissance. So what we end up with when the Great Plague hit Europe was there was the ability to do a lot of things that previously weren't possible. There was the printing press that was invented pretty soon afterwards. And there was this sudden lack of labor that was needed for everything. And lots of people had died off. So there weren't enough people to do the labor that was needed. And wages went up. We see this in the US right now. If you don't have enough people and you strangle immigration for a while, wages start going up. And that led to the rise of a middle class and the ability to have, the kind of things go well. World War I ending. This was something that was kind of forced by humans in kind of an accidental way, I think, in a way that's very worth paying attention to, in that when you try and fix things, you can break things very badly. And then after that, we see World War II, which was obviously devastating, and the Cold War led to our current kind of very stable world where things work. And then the last one, which I think is partly joking, is the rise of the internet, leading to a lot of social dissolution and a lot of problematic things that hopefully humanity manages to get through okay, but could be, it's a very destabilizing thing to have this new technology. So we do see, I think, very clearly that there are both of these dynamics that exist. So there's a kind of very general framing that I want to put on this, which is when things are stable, everything adapts to them. That leads to a useful system as long as nothing changes. And to the extent that things are very stable, organisms and systems stop needing to be robust to disruption and become more and more fragile. So the charts at the bottom, I think, are two really interesting examples of when things adapt quickly, they destabilize. And when things kind of can move slowly, then they can develop mutualism better. And then the other one is when you have a lot of redundancy in an organism's genes, then it's much, especially kind of bacteria and viruses, where they need, genetic integrity is really critical. It turns out that the mutation rate is kind of very closely, which is kind of how much they adapt, is very closely related to how fragile they are in terms of having less redundancy. So these dynamics, I want to say again, are very fundamental. They're not something that's a product of the way humans interact. They're a function of some very fundamental forces in nature. So moving past this, I want to talk about what cooperation is, because I think that this is important for the discussion a little bit later. When we talk about cooperating, when two people cooperate, we're not usually thinking of just the simple game theoretic idea of things ending up in a situation where there is mutual benefit. That's not enough for us to use the word cooperate normally. I have a note at the bottom. Cooperation technically in biology is within species. So viruses can cooperate with one another, but the relationship between humans and their gut bacteria is mutualism, which is mutual benefit. But we would think that we can cooperate with, let's say, higher mammals, or at the very least, AI and aliens, which we would expect could at some point be sentient, AI and aliens, which presumably would be. We can cooperate with them, we hope, right? That's something that's plausible. Are we cooperating when we have political allies? Well, it kind of depends. Are we using them because we're both gaining and it happens to be temporarily beneficial? Is that that what we mean by cooperating? In a sense, yes. In a sense, we don't really care about motives, but there does have to be something there. And even kind of geopolitical enemies, we have this idea that the US and Russia were cooperating during the Cold War in not killing everyone. Is that, the ideal of cooperation that we hope for? Obviously not, but there was cooperation there of a sort. And the question is, what's fundamental for doing this? I do want to point out, Greg Lewis has a recent paper where he points out that viruses can send costly signals humans send a costly signal by raising their body temperature to viruses. And it seems like viruses should be able to survive pretty well, but they slow down their reproduction in order to, in response to this signal. If they wouldn't, then the human would end up much worse off and the virus would have a less useful host. So it turns out that it's a good signal, it's costly, but humans are talking to the virome, not to something that they can really cooperate with in the sense that we're thinking of. So I'm going to claim, and I'd be really interested in people's thoughts on this, that when we're thinking about cooperation, obviously there has to be potential mutual benefit. And for it to be cooperation, you have to have a potential for defection. It's not cooperation if no matter what, everybody's better off. There has to be some intention. There has to be some idea that we understand what it is that the other person or being that we're cooperating with is thinking or doing, so that it's intentional cooperation. There's something that is not just an evolutionary dynamic where things kind of end up in a better situation. And then the last one, I think, is critical, because if we don't want to get stuck in traps, what we care about for cooperation is doing it even when it's hard. So prisoner's dilemma cooperation is like what we really care about, right? Cooperating when there's a large benefit and a very small gain, and the Nash equilibrium is that everybody should cooperate, is nice. We're not opposed to it, but also it's kind of easy mode. That's not what we really want to focus on when we talk about encouraging cooperation. So you either need empathy, which is essentially your utility function caring about what the other person gets. So if you're playing the prisoner's dilemma, if I'm playing the prisoner's dilemma with, say, my wife, well, if she gets $10, then I benefit also. I'm really happy with her getting, and if both of us lose out, well, we're kind of unhappy. And if she loses at my expense or I lose at her expense, that has kind of other issues in our relationship. So you could imagine that it's very easy to cooperate if you care enough about the outcome for the other person. There's also what game theorists either aspirationally or dismissively talk about as super rational strategy, which is that you could imagine that, and I think Martin Gardner in one of his early columns in it was Scientific American, he talked about, like, what should you do if you're rational in the prisoner's dilemma? And he asked a bunch of people, and everybody was like, you defect. Obviously you defect, because defecting is better. And he was like, no, that's not what you should say. You should say, look, if there are other people who are smart and good and like are interested in being more than just narrowly rational, but super rational, then they should agree that cooperating is better. They should just agree to that, because they can step back from the situation and see that otherwise you end up stuck in this trap. And that doesn't require empathy. It requires something else, which I think is closely related to what some of the AI safety people have spent a bunch of time thinking about when they talk about decision theories, where they'd like a decision theory for AI systems such that the AI system wants to cooperate. That seems really important. We want them to not defect. And how do you get that? And one of the ways that they have formulated that is to say, I guess there's updateless and functional, and I'm not going to try and differentiate between them. But if you imagine that you're supposed to make the decision such that if the other person makes the same, that if the other person makes the same decision you do, then you're better off, or that you in some way kind of influence what it is that other people do because you've chosen a set of strategies that gets you to a certain outcome, then you've effectively committed to cooperating. And there are a couple of different ways to formulate this, but essentially it's figuring out a way to formulate it so that the rational act is to cooperate. And it helps with a bunch of other dilemmas also. But you have to have something that gets you past this problem of not cooperating. So I do want to point out Gary Drescher's book, which is fantastic, that tries to build a theory of ethics based around kind of the idea that you should cooperate with other people because there's this kind of counterfactual reality that if you don't, then everybody's worse off. And I think he does a better job of explaining it, but it is a fairly complex thing. And I think it falls apart a little bit. But one of the key things that I think it doesn't manage is that it says ethics doesn't include anything that couldn't, at least in theory, have cooperated with you. So if you care about animal suffering, you could imagine that cows could, in some counterfactual way, have done something that was mean to humans, and you want to treat them nicely instead. It's harder to make that claim about fish, even if we think that they undergo suffering. So I think there's something not quite fully complete about trying to tie all of ethics into this idea of cooperation, but I think that there's a lot here that we do care about. So if we cooperate, if we can get past what Mark Miller was talking about in terms of if we can move towards Pareto-tropism, we have this really great ability to gain tremendous benefit. And I think that this is important. And I think that figuring out how to build cooperation is an essential part of this. And I think that, as Forsyth has said in many ways, and I think they're right, that credible commitments in blockchain provide technology that allow this to happen. And I think that that's part of what it is that we need to do. I think that there's still more in terms of understanding the roots of cooperation. And this gets us potentially very far. It builds a tremendous potential for Eucatastrophe. It puts a lot of the things in terms of having an actual vision for what it is that things would look like if they're better. And I think that building a more comprehensive vision of what it is that a positive future looks like is critical, as I said earlier, for Eucatastrophe. And that allows for things to get much better very quickly. I have a paper, and this is where I pitch the other thing that I've been thinking about a lot recently. I have a paper with Anders Sandberg that came out, with a preprint came out recently. Or I guess not that recently. Wow, time flies during the pandemic. And it argues that there are some fundamental limits to value in the universe, that value is not infinite. And I don't want to go through that argument in detail, but Adam Brown pointed out something that I think is really, really interesting about this, which is that there will be at some point a transition from exponential growth, where you're filling up the space that you have. And if you imagine kind of any organism has some potential to fill up the area around it in a useful way, but at some point they fill up the space available. And I think there are fundamentally a couple of different ways that this can end. In some cases, you end up with something kind of growing and poisoning its environment in ways that are self-limiting. So yeast in beer kills itself off because it multiplies enough that it creates enough alcohol that it dies. And we're hoping that humanity manages to figure out climate change and doesn't kind of poison themselves out of existence. That would be particularly worrying. There are kind of other ways for things to end that would be very problematic. The other way that things can end, I think or not end, but limit growth is running into others. And, Robin Hansen's Crabby Aliens is kind of the model for this in the long term, which is we run into something else. But even before then, there's this fundamental limit of the speed of light where at some point we stop getting more stuff and having more space in an exponential fashion because we can only expand outward from Earth at the speed of light, which means that we're colonizing space and the growth of the volume of a sphere is polynomial, not exponential. So over time, we shift out of an exponential growth phase to only a polynomial growth phase. And as we say in the conclusion to the paper, you might think that this is somewhat pessimistic, but not having infinities available, only having inconceivably large amounts of possible value in the future is a hopeful thing, even if it's limited. So that's, I want to kind of end with, humanity has a lot of ability to move forward. And I think that there's a tremendous potential here, but there are obstacles. So we need to kind of think about how to surmount them and how to manage cooperation in the future.
Thank you so much, David. And I guess, would you be up to take a few questions now?
Yes, I'm very excited to take questions. That is what I'm hoping for.
Well,
if anybody is willing to.
Participants can unmute themselves.
Ask.
And people can unmute themselves. And so if you have any question, either post in the chat or let us know. Jump in.
I have one, Lou.
Yeah, go ahead, Creon.
Oh yeah, let me turn on my video just for fun. Hey, thanks for an interesting and thought-provoking discussion. There's a slide you had near the very beginning where you had hand-drawn a graph that showed kind of catastrophe, Eucatastrophe repetition. Might you put that slide up again?
Yeah, I can put that back up. I
wanted to mention some kind of interesting possibility. It was right around with the Pareto stuff and all this. Anyway, I'm not saying this is true, but it's interesting to consider it. And that is, if we look at that graph and we, oh, look, it's even the title of the talk. Yeah. And if we imagine it flipped upside down. And the reason I say that is because you could imagine, or you imagine like these kind of energy landscapes or optimality landscapes, it's always a question, where do you put the optimal direction? Is it the peak or the valley? So in terms of like chemical dynamics, an energy or a physical system, it tends towards the valleys. It tends towards energy minimization and go to the state of lowest energy. But if you flip it around, we might have a situation where it looks like a catastrophe now, which would be in the upwards direction, and a eucatastrophe would be back in the downwards direction. A catastrophe provides the activation energy to get over the saddle point. So a catastrophe stirs things up, like, the meteor crashes into the thing, or the oxygen goes crazy, or whatever it might, or, the internet goes crazy, like whatever it is, it stirs it up. It provides activation energy. You wouldn't otherwise have gotten over the energy barrier. And then you can boom down into a new attractor state, perhaps better, that is, or at least more complexity or something like that. So that's another way of looking at it. It's the same thing. Obviously, it's an isomorphism to flip it upside down. But I think that's an interesting way of thinking about it, that a catastrophe, even a world war or something like that, or an extinction event, opens lots of new niches, that whole thing.
Yeah, I like the idea of talking about this in terms of activation energy needed for eucatastrophe, for things to change significantly. I think the critical additional piece is usually when we're talking about activation, and well, I guess two things that are interesting here. One is usually when we're talking about activation energy, we know what the final state is because we're talking about activation energy for a specific reaction. And not all catastrophes, I don't have this on the graph, but there are catastrophes that just make things worse for a while and they just stay that way. I didn't put this on the list, but the fall of Rome was bad and it stayed bad. And yes, the Dark Ages weren't fully dark, but like it was just, I think, unambiguously worse for a while. And, it's not always activation energy. It can also just be, an increase of entropy that doesn't provide a benefit. And then the other thing that I think is really useful about that framing is that one of the things we look for in chemical engineering and chemistry is we want to be able to reduce the activation energy needed to do a reaction. That's really important because it means that the reaction can happen more or better or faster or be possible at all. And I think that that's a really fruitful way of thinking about what it is we want. We want to minimize the size of a catastrophe needed in order to allow a eucatastrophe to happen. Hopefully to the point where we don't need any destabilization at all.
I think we may have two questions. Matthias and Phil, am I understanding correctly? You're raising your hand. Okay, well, feel free to jump in. You can unmute yourself. Matthias, go ahead and then we'll do Phil.
Okay, hello. Okay, it's just like this. So yes, good to see you, David. I sort of have a question that's, I guess, a little bit tangential. Well, I don't know. So the way I think about catastrophes is that typically a catastrophe works by, there is kind of a sort of a small event somewhere that sort of starts out and then its influence propagates by some sort of a mechanism. And the thing that is kind of always interesting to look at is like, what is that mechanism for any given catastrophe, right? For COVID, it's going to be, person-to-person virus transmission. For other catastrophes, it might be something else. It could be even sort of mixed. And I'm just sort of curious, like, how do sort of the eucatastrophes and catastrophes sort of compare on the level of kind of the sort of the mechanism by which their influence spreads? Like, is there any difference of, between them on that level or not? Thanks.
Yeah, that's an interesting. I have not thought about it in those terms. I think there are places where it's true that kind of breakdown happens starting one place and spreading. The asteroids hitting Earth isn't a small thing that topples things. It's just a really large thing. Whereas the start of World War I was very clearly an unsteady pile of dominoes that got knocked over by an idiot with a gun who decided that they should assassinate some royalty. Like, it was really a very small thing that led to a massive change. On the other hand, the invention of the internet was a small thing that led to kind of a fundamental transformation. I think Eliezer Yudkowsky has a thing about how people often have this idea that there's this like amazing thing that will fix everything, that will make the whole world better, that will, and they have this idea that it's going to be amazing. And in the entire history of the world, there has been exactly one person who was right, and it's Francis Bacon. And yeah, science just really is that good. So like, there are times when it's just like, yeah, this really small thing that does change things. So I like the question about whether it's a small change causing large ones, or a large change that does that, but I'm not sure that it's necessarily either. I want to think about it more. There are a couple of questions in the chat, but I think Phil might have been first.
Yeah, let's go for Phil, and then we'll take the questions in the chat.
Oh, yeah, first I appreciate, I think I have multiple questions. Definitely appreciate you bringing this in and connecting to existential hope. And especially from thinking about potentially civilization collapse, that there could be positive things that come out of it, and not just bad things. I think there's one part where I'm thinking about, potentially now, how do we make sure that, that the catastrophe doesn't kill all of us, like AGI or something like that? And then the other question ends up being, how are we able to shift or create things to make sure that the dynamics of the catastrophe actually come into being? Or how do we do that?
Yeah. So I guess to answer the first one first, yeah, catastrophes aren't good. They provide activation energy, but we should avoid them if we can do that without, if we can create things, if we can make things a lot better without having catastrophes, that is better. And certainly there are catastrophes that are large enough or devastating enough that we should not have them happen. I would be happiest if we could find ways to reduce the activation energy to a point where we don't need any at all, or we just need somebody to say, hey, we should fix this, and that's enough to like get people to do it. And occasionally that does happen. Occasionally it's just coming up with the idea and suggesting it, or just going and doing it. And all you need is, to raise some funding, or to, just like announce the idea. I think the guy who got Port of Long Beach to relax the restriction on stacking crates, it was just like, he just needed to point it out loudly. And then like everyone's like, oh yeah, that's right, let's fix that. And that's all that was needed. Sometimes it's just that. So I think to the extent that we can make it happen, that things can improve without needing catastrophes, that's important. So that leads exactly to your second question, which is, okay, so how do we do that? And I think that's a hard question, and I don't have an answer in general. I do have thoughts about how to influence policymakers. That's kind of narrow to that. I have some thoughts on how it is the technological change happens, though there are people who have been thinking about that much more deeply recently than I have. So I won't, I'm not going to kind of pontificate about this because I haven't thought about it much. But yeah, I think that that's exactly the question is, how do we do that? I think one step that Foresight has been talking about that I think is really valuable, and other people have started talking about this, is one thing we need to do is just talk about what good things could happen and what they look like. And, in kind of the very narrow sense, it's hard to push for, let's say universal basic income until somebody has the idea, hey, maybe we should have universal basic income, and this is what it would look like. So that's kind of maybe not even step one, but step 0 in pushing for change is just get the idea. I think Rick had put a question in the chat. He's welcome to say it out loud if he'd like, or I can, yeah.
Yeah, I was looking at your list that seemed to be a list of cooperation required. It started with potential mutual benefit. And what is not on the list, and I'm amused or puzzled, is neither communication nor negotiation are in there. And, you know, the prisoner's dilemma is only a dilemma when there's no communication, you know, and people are pouring an enormous amount of thought into decision theories that work even if there's no communication. Well, perhaps you should just fix the communication gap.
Yeah, that's kind of unambiguously an oversight on my part, and you're completely right. I think the piece that I'd add to that is we do want situations where communication can accomplish something, and I think in a lot of game theoretic, there's that game that, you know, the two people, there's a game show where two people play the whole game show, and then at the end there are two balls, and each of them gets to you know, steal or share, I guess. I don't remember exactly what the term is. And, you know, the two of them talk to each other for like 5 minutes beforehand because it makes a lot of great dramatic tension. And then they reveal and, you know, a bunch of the time, you know, somebody just like, okay, I'm gonna, you know, like they look really nice and act really nice, and then they steal the money. But communication doesn't solve all of these problems. It's definitely important, but I think the commitment mechanisms matter also. Maybe I can answer the questions you put in the chat also, because I want to point out, theory of mind and intention are related, but not exactly the same thing, which is the theory of mind is required for me to understand that the other person is cooperating intentionally, not that I need it to be able to cooperate, but I need it to understand that this is cooperation that's happening, not just you know, me managing to get more out of this by picking something. And yeah, I think the distinction that I'm trying to draw, and it's not really between mutualism and cooperation, but I don't have better terms, is between the kind of cooperation that we really care about, which is when people are actively trying to do better and fix things, versus kind of sometimes that's just the Nash equilibrium. And it's good. We're happy when the Nash equilibrium is everybody is better off. But that's not, you know, maybe this is the wrong framing, but it's not morally praiseworthy to pick the action that makes everybody better off if there's no benefit in not doing that. I'm not worried that it doesn't happen then. You know, the one that I'm worried about is the one where you do need something more than just kind of the basics of.
I'd like to speak briefly to that morally
Please.
better. There's occasionally this conversation about there's no such thing as real altruism. We're always working for our own benefit. And my response to that is fine. You've got ulterior motives for doing good. Bring your ulterior motives to the game. Do good with your ulterior motives. I love it.
No, I agree. I think I don't need people to be purely altruistic, though. On some level, what I'm trying to point out with empathy is, you know, one of the benefits of altruism is I feel good when other people are happier. Eliezer Yudkowsky has a short story, I think, called The Truth Prisoner's Dilemma, which is like, at some point there are places where, like, no, you don't actually have any benefit. You don't actually have any empathic connection. There's nothing there. It's just a question of, do you cooperate or not? And that's harder. And I'd be happy, I'm really happy if people cooperate and are altruistic for ulterior motive reasons. I'd be even happier if we could figure out ways to get cooperation to happen even more often. And some of the time, I think that requires something more than just, you know, don't be a jerk and care about other people.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think Joy Livingwell's point, if the system depends entirely on mutual benefit, then if there isn't mutual benefit, it breaks, is an important point. Is yeah, you don't want to build systems that are fragile in that way. Yeah, Allison has a question. I just want to respond to Brian's question, why use the growth rate of a sphere? The question isn't what is the actual sphere of influence for humans? It's what is the potential limit? Meaning if what it is that we care about grows as quickly as it possibly could, at some point it hits a limit because there's a limited amount of energy and physical space, and then you're stuck at that limit. That's not to say that there aren't reasons to have it not function that way. Allison has a question, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, this is more organizational, but you mentioned a book, you mentioned this paper, and then, we briefly discussed your past papers. I'd love to see, does the book somehow, like, how does the book on cooperation in general actually gets informed by this paper, or like, what's next for you now in terms of writing? Because you seem to be spinning out just so much incredible research. I mean, a paper that I often reference from you is just fragile world hypothesis, which I think is getting should be getting much more traction, and just pointing out that even if we just continue the way that we do, just with the level of computer security and so forth that we have, we're already in a very fragile world. And so anyway, just like what's left on your kind of research stack? What can we look you?
So I'm pulling up my outline for what the book might look like, and this is, I think, so what I want to do is kind of the kind of overused grand history of the universe from some lens, and the lens I want to talk about is cooperation. But I think there's a lot about what it is that the fundamentals are of cooperation, and what it is that happens and how cooperation happens at small scales and increasingly large scales. And I think that scaling up cooperation from, I cooperate with my wife because we live in the same home and we deal with our children, and like that's kind of the selfish cooperation, to I cooperate with people in my community, to I cooperate with people in my country, to the country cooperates. There's a mechanism there to allow them to do so, and then between countries, how do countries cooperate with one another? And it gets harder as you scale up. And that's bad because it needs to scale up. Like, it needs to finish scaling. We need to figure out how it is that this works. We especially need to figure this out if we want to cooperate in the, well, hopefully not too near future with artificial intelligences or potentially aliens, because it's really important to have figured out how to cooperate before we're in a position where it's a true prisoner's dilemma, where we can't rely on, we feel altruistic because they're nice, because the aliens are scary looking bug-eyed spiders, and they have no goals that they share with us, and we still need to cooperate because otherwise things are much worse for everyone. So the hope is to deal with that. That's this project that's going slower than I'd like, though I still have this idea that maybe I'll hit my 70% probability that I'd submit this pitch to as a actual pitch to somebody by the end of the year. And so I predicted that. So I might be wrong. I might still be wrong, but I'm pushing hard because I'd like to be right about it, which is, yeah. And then I'm doing lots of other things that are completely unrelated. I think Joy had a question.
I have a request, actually. This is a community request. This speaks directly to the need to communicate clearly in order to do the cooperation we want to happen, and in order to persuade other people to do it. Eucatastrophe is a terrible, terrible, terrible word, and we need to ban that sucker. Now, I never say X risk. I talk about existential risks and I talk about E risks. I never say X risk. Why? Because I don't want even one important person to ever misunderstand and say, oh, it's not a risk anymore. I can ignore it. I don't need to do anything. Okay. Eucatastrophe, the way brains work is, in order to negate something, let's do a little experiment. Notice what happens in your brain when I say non-horse. Okay. You had to think of a horse in order to negate it. So everybody who hears Eucatastrophe, in order to understand it, has to think catastrophe. Think if, look, there are probably no murderers in this room. Think if you were, how would you feel about being known as a non-murderer, even though it's true, right? So we need to pick something that is not going to generate an emotional UG field in anybody who hears it, and is going to subtly, sneakily give them a bad emotional connection with this very wonderful thing that we're trying to do. We need to figure out a term that is going to get people inspired and fired up and willing to take action. So I challenge this group, let's fix this thing.
Yeah, I will say this was brought up to me in the past. Seth Baum at GCRI pointed this out and also hates this term with a passion. And I think existential hope is a much better phrase. Windfall. So the problem that I have is nothing quite captures this. I think the corresponding.
We need to build it. We need to build the term, even if we have to call it, Yorkalization or something. We need to build a term that will actually do the job. And I would say existential hope is way better than Eucatastrophe, but it's still not very good because there are too many people that misunderstand the existential part. So we need to come up with, this is a nerd problem, right?
Yeah, no,
Nerds do the best
but
words
it's the problem.
the best words and the worst words. And I work in the area of language patterns and how they influence thinking. So this is not a trivial thing. This is actually a pretty important thing to getting our message across. So this is a bright bunch of people. We can do this.
Yeah. So windfall is in the, the FHI has the windfall clause for if an AI system takes off really quickly and ends up doing really well, that's a windfall. I'm not sure that captures everything that we want. The other term that we don't have a counterpart for, and I think maybe Creon's framing of this is the better one, and we should use it even more, is of activation energy. But we don't have a good counterpart to the word risk, like risk and benefit. Like risk is bad. Everybody dislikes risk. Everybody likes benefit, but it's not the opposite of risk. It's like, it's related in a different way. We don't have a good opposite.
Risk is considered a probabilistic, risk is a probability of failure or a probability of bad outcome. Right. Benefit is just a good outcome, right?
Right. So
we need to be careful.
It's right. So it's not symmetric. Probability of good outcome kind of doesn't work either. So I would be grateful, and I would switch terminology as soon as I have as soon as we can coordinate around a different term. I'll tell Toby and Owen that we're, and I think Toby and Owen are on the same page. I don't know, but I would guess that they would also be happy for a better term. I think that's better.
Maybe we could launch a bounty on this, or actually you could all go into, if you want to work on this asynchronously, go into the Discord existential hope channel and make your propositions. I'm not a ancient Greek speaker, but I think catastrophe means like downward turn. What is the contrary of kata? It could be upward.
It's meta, actually.
Meta.
A metastrophe.
Metastrophe.
Oh, that sounds like a cancer. No, thank you. No.
I'm just thinking of catabolism and metabolism, and meta meaning above.
Yeah. So this is for Seth Baum, who evidently it's from Wiktionary. But yeah, downturn, which it's not Eustrophe doesn't quite get there.
Yeah,
So
and
I don't know, maybe it's better than
you has the unfortunate, and in American English anyway, you has an unfortunate thing where we go, ew, if something is disgusting. So it's like, ew, catastrophe. You know, it's just like bad piled on bad.
You has no functional understanding in American English. Okay, you're not getting anything out of that word that's positive. Yeah, you can get some negative stuff, but you got no positive. So this term eucatastrophe is an unmitigated disaster in multiple ways.
Yeah, I would be happy with my suggestion there was not a serious contender, but yeah, something would be better than this. I'm with you. Okay.
Yeah, there was a similar thing in psychological research and where they're talking about people who are especially good at something. The first term somebody came up with was positive deviance. You know, like who wants to be a positive deviant, right? And then they went, well, why don't we talk about positive exceptions? Right, these are exceptional people who are doing exceptionally well. And okay, all of a sudden people are willing to be a positive exception who would not be happy about being a positive deviant.
Yeah, I think that's, though it's still used, the phrase positive deviance is still used in like, healthcare, systemic healthcare stuff, where they talk about positive deviance and like, hey, this hospital has, no infections and all the other hospitals have some, and that's positive deviance. And I agree with you. It's not, it's an unfortunate term. Okay. Well, I would be happy to continue talking with people. But I also,
I have one more question, a very quick one, in case you can do the interminutes. And I know that you said, like one thing about this is that it's not like just specific events, but if you would have to point to a few specific things where you're like, yeah, this is probably, like a moment of a eucatastrophe, right? Like, and I know that you said, science is at least a contender, and it's probably not just one single event, right? But we also said that catastrophes tend to cause more than this uptake span, or at least like correlate with it as a precursor to them or something. And then like, are there specific things where like, yeah, this is probably one thing where like, we could be looking forward to it in the future, where it's like probably very good. And I think for me, like one of the potential ones maybe is, escape velocity and longevity, or at least significantly slowing or reversing the aging process. That seems to be pretty good. But yeah, are there any others?
I'd say longevity is definitely one of them. Elimination of diseases, I think, is actually a pretty near-term one. The fact that we haven't wiped out, a dozen more diseases than just small, but polio, we're getting close. Like that's a really near term. Like we have a eucatastrophe that's just around the corner. We could do that with a bunch of other diseases if we decided to pour in the billions of dollars that it would take. So those would be really good. I think there's a eucatastrophe in eliminating some of the current negative things that are happening. I think that there's a mental health eucatastrophe that's possible or plausible, in that we do a horrible job dealing with mental health, and that would be amazing to fix. There are animal welfare is another one where like we have a eucatastrophe sitting there waiting for us if we can fix this. Yes, they're out there. Identifying more of them would be great. I think. eliminating the need, eliminating basic needs, eliminating poverty globally is one of the ones that we're also not that far from, meaning in the long term. Humanity has hopefully, tens of billions of years in the future to exist, and a universe. And we should get to these in the next, certainly million. All of these should be checked off, hopefully much sooner than that.
I remember when I asked you about, for example, super cheap energy, and you're like, maybe that doesn't actually do very much. So
on its own, super cheap energy is, super cheap energy is really important, but on its own, that doesn't fix everything. I think it would make a big difference for a lot of things. It would change a lot. It would certainly be a Eucatastrophe. I don't know if it, in some ways, that is the Eucatastrophe that causes good things to happen afterwards. So in a sense, that is the kind of shorter term goal. In a similar way to, making a vaccine for something is the thing that causes us to be able to eliminate the disease, if we bother to do that. I think getting the levers in place is certainly important. There are lots of them. There's a lot to do. There's a lot that's achievable. None of this is super straightforward, but I don't think there's anything that we've said that is in any way implausible in the short term for humanity. I am hopeful.
Wonderful, David. Thank you so much.